What if the house you served in began to remember every scream it ever silenced? What if a scar wasn't just punishment, but a mark of something far older, waiting beneath the soil? And what happens when the forgotten decide not to stay buried? This isn't just a story of vengeance. It's a story of memory, and of a girl who became more than a name whispered in fear. Are you ready to hear what the Gibbons house tried to erase? If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. Charleston, South Carolina. The year was 1822, and the summer heat had already begun to rot the air. Flies circled like black omens above the cobbled square, where a crowd gathered in silence more reverent than cruel. No laughter, no jeers. Only the clink of metal and the slow hiss of a brazier coming to life. Aziza stood with her wrists bound and her bare back exposed, though it was not shame that made her tremble. It was the knowledge that once the iron met her skin, she would never again be seen as a girl, only a warning. She was 17 and had never spoken out of turn, but days earlier, she had struck the overseer's hand when it reached for her younger brother. Isaiah, no older than 10, had been accused of stealing a silver spoon, something no one believed but everyone accepted. Aziza had stepped between them, and in doing so, had written her own fate. The master's voice had been calm when he pronounced judgment. "She will bear the mark," he said, as though speaking of cattle. No one objected, not even the preacher. Now, as the iron turned red, she could smell the future burning before it touched her skin. The man who held the brand had no name. His face was wrapped in a kerchief, and his eyes avoided hers. He pressed the iron to her shoulder with mechanical precision. A sharp sizzle, the smell of meat. Aziza did not scream. That silence was her first act of defiance. When it was over, they left her there, slumped in the dust, the skin of her shoulder still smoking. Children stared. Women turned away. The men shuffled back to their duties. Nothing had changed, and yet, for Aziza, everything had. Her body now spoke a language of pain, and her silence had learned to scream inward. That night, as the others tended her wound in the dark of the quarters, she did not cry. Instead, she listened. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper through the trees, became part of a new lexicon. She understood that survival was not merely endurance, it was absorption, observation. She would watch, and in watching, she would remember. Isaiah never spoke of what happened. His eyes no longer met hers. He worked longer hours, grew stronger, and stopped playing with the other boys. At night, she could hear him muttering to himself, words not meant for the living. The boy she had tried to protect was already retreating into another world. Aziza's mark never healed cleanly. It blistered, then cracked, leaving a jagged scar shaped like a crooked letter no one could read. But those who saw it flinched. Not from pity, from fear. It marked her not only as punished, but as untouchable. She belonged to something darker now, something that walked alongside the lash and the chain, but answered to neither. In the months that followed, she was no longer sent to the fields. Instead, she was summoned to the great house. Not for kindness, never that. The mistress needed a silent girl, one who didn't flinch at cruelty, to assist in the kitchen and clean up what others left behind. Aziza obeyed. She moved through hallways like a shadow, speaking only when spoken to, her gaze always lowered. But behind that gaze, the world rearranged itself. The laughter of the white children became jagged notes. The prayers before meals reeked of rot. And the master's voice, once a distant thunder, now sounded like a man already hollowed from within. The scar on her shoulder itched at night. Sometimes it burned, waking her from sleep with the sensation of being branded anew. And in those moments, she would stare into the dark and imagine a world inverted, not out of vengeance, but out of balance. A world where silence did not mean submission, but strategy, where marks did not shame, but summoned something older than pain. And so began the watchful season, the time of eyes opened and mouths closed. Aziza, once a name whispered in affection, became a presence to be avoided. Even the dogs didn't follow her anymore. In Charleston, the air thickened with rumors of rebellion, of drums in distant forests, of vanished overseers and strange lights near the coast. But none suspected the girl with the slow steps and the ruined shoulder. They had already decided she was broken. They were wrong. They called it the Gibbons house, though the land stretched far beyond its white columns and shuttered windows. It was not merely a residence, it was a domain, set atop a rise that overlooked the cotton fields like a watchtower. The house itself exuded a sense of order, symmetrical, polished, pristine, but the deeper one stepped into its silence, the more that order revealed itself as a mask. Aziza was brought there at the end of summer, her transfer unannounced and unquestioned. The quarters whispered of it as a promotion, though none said it with joy. The great house devoured those it absorbed. You entered it clean, and you left it changed, or didn't leave at all. She was assigned to the kitchen, beneath the charge of Miss Tilda, an old, sharp-tongued cook who had once lost her voice to a fever and now spoke with a hiss like boiling oil. Tilda didn't ask questions. She pointed, and Aziza obeyed. Chop, scrub, boil. Silence was the rule, and Aziza excelled at silence. But there were patterns, and Aziza watched them all. Mr. Gibbons rose before dawn and spoke only to his dogs. He read letters with trembling hands and burned them afterward, even in summer. His wife, Eugenia, drifted like smoke through rooms she did not command. She arranged flowers obsessively, changing their order twice a day, though none ever died in her vases. There was something brittle in her eyes, like glass stretched too thin. Their children, Henry and Lila, were ghosts of another sort, restless, cruel, and bored. Henry hunted animals he didn't eat. Lila whispered secrets into jars and buried them beneath the porch. Neither seemed aware of Aziza, yet neither ignored her fully. They sensed something different in her, though they lacked the words to name it. At night, Aziza slept in a storage room beside the kitchen. It was lined with shelves and the faint, sour smell of vinegar. But she didn't mind. She had a place to hide, and in hiding, she listened. Above her, the house creaked with conversations never meant for her ears. Footsteps passed at strange hours. Doors opened to rooms that no one ever used. One evening, while cleaning the silver, Aziza heard something from the parlor. Eugenia's voice, shrill and clipped. "The girl unnerves me," she said. "She moves like she's counting the walls." The reply was muffled. Mr. Gibbons, perhaps, but the tone was clear. He didn't care. Aziza learned more from the pantry than most learned from books, who drank too much, who lied before God, who feared the shadows in their own homes. There were servants who gossiped, yes, but Aziza was something else, a vessel. She absorbed, catalogued, remembered. She found the first note behind a loose brick near the hearth, a piece of cloth folded with care, its message sewn in dark thread. The roots drink deeper than the branches know. It was unsigned, but the stitchwork was steady, not a warning, a statement. Aziza kept it beneath her pillow. In time, she found others, beneath a loose floorboard, inside an old teapot, stitched into the lining of a winter coat, short phrases, sometimes no more than a word, names of people long dead, locations that no longer existed, directions written in the code of the enslaved. She did not yet know what they meant, but they were not random. Someone, or someones, had left them. Left them for whom? The air inside the Gibbons house had a taste, not rot, but rot delayed. Sweetness turned just sour enough to linger. Guests came often, planters, ministers, surveyors, all smiled too much and left too quickly. Aziza served them tea, removed their coats, and studied their hands. Many bore rings with unfamiliar crests. Some trembled when she touched them. Others stared through her as though they feared being seen in return. Isaiah's absence grew louder in her memory. She wondered if he would recognize her now, if her silence had grown too deep to be bridged. The scar on her shoulder no longer pained her, but some nights it tingled, as though something beyond her had begun to wake. Autumn approached, and with it, a sense of tightening. Less laughter, fewer guests, whispers replaced greetings, and always, the sound of locks turning, even when no one had entered or left. Aziza never asked questions, but every answer was waiting. The Gibbons kitchen was a world of its own, separate from the opulence above, yet tethered to it by the invisible cords of duty and appetite. Fires never died there, not fully. Pots hissed, knives sang against stone, and the scent of onions and lard soaked into the walls like memory. In that heat, time loosened, days blurred, but Aziza kept her own rhythm, counted by steps, by cuts, by the turning of the spoon. One afternoon, Miss Tilda was called upstairs for a matter involving the mistress's favorite porcelain. She left Aziza alone, with the bread halfway risen and a hen gutted on the counter. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was alert. Aziza used the time to search. She had noticed it days earlier, an uneven gap behind a row of pickling jars, the kind of space where dust collects secrets. She reached in and found not dust, but a book, thick, bound in oilcloth, with the spine cracked and pages soft from touch. A kitchen ledger, perhaps, but inside, the words were more than recipes. Yes, there were instructions, measurements, herbs, mixtures for preserving meat and flavoring broth. But scrawled between them were notes that wandered from the culinary to the cryptic. Too much hyssop dulls the tongue but sharpens the eye. Boil bones under full moon only, never before dusk. His breath slowed on the third night. She wept. I did not. The ink changed with each entry. Some letters were round and neat, others jagged, desperate, written as though the hand that held the pen shook with urgency. Names were crossed out. Dates repeated themselves. And in the margins, symbols Aziza didn't recognize, circles bisected by arrows, triangles with one point blackened. Near the center of the book, one page bore only a single sentence. The house has ears, but forgets what it hears. Beneath it, a smear of dried rose-colored wax. Aziza did not feel fear. What she felt was recognition. She returned the book carefully, but now she knew it was there. And night after night, she read by stolen candlelight, tracing the words left by hands that once stirred the same pots and swept the same ash. These were not spells, not quite. They were recollections disguised as instructions, recipes for resistance, coded in the language of obedience. Miss Tilda never mentioned the book, but she watched Aziza more closely afterward. Her eyes, cloudy with age, flickered when Aziza added certain herbs without being told. When she reached for vinegar before salt, there was knowledge passed between them in silence, not alliance, just awareness. One entry spoke of the red month, when the master of the house bled from the mouth and died within days. No one blamed the roast. No one questioned the wine. It was dated 30 years before. Different family, same house. Aziza began experimenting in whispers, a pinch more clove than necessary, a bay leaf burned before baking. Not poison, never yet, just signals, just echoes. The house noticed. Doors that once stayed shut now creaked open on their own. The cold pantry, always dry, began to sweat at dusk. Twice, she found silverware rearranged in perfect symmetry. Once, a spoon with her name scratched faintly into the handle. No one had seen her name since the branding. Downstairs, the other servants grew distant. One girl, Clara, crossed herself every time Aziza entered the room. The boy who chopped wood avoided eye contact entirely. Only Miss Tilda remained unchanged, though her voice, what remained of it, grew raspier, as though something tugged at her throat from the inside. Then, one night, as Aziza turned a page near the back of the book, a sheet slipped free. Not paper, fabric, a square of linen, stained with something dark. It bore a drawing stitched in thread the color of dried blood, a hand with 7 fingers, each one bending in a different direction. Below it, 4 words. We were never alone. Aziza folded the cloth, placed it beneath her mattress, and slept without dreams. From that night forward, she no longer looked at the house as a place. It was a container of memory, of intent, of unfinished things. Something had begun long before she arrived. She had merely stepped into the middle of it, and the kitchen, heart of the house, was no longer merely where food was made. It was where truth simmered, quietly, carefully, waiting to be served. Winter crept over the land without ceremony, a cold silence settling into the bones of the Gibbons estate. Fires burned longer, boots tracked mud through the halls, and the days shortened like held breath. It was during this season, when the fields lay dormant and the wind carried whispers across bare branches, that Isaiah returned. No one spoke of his arrival. No carriage came. No introduction followed. Aziza saw him first through the scullery window, standing alone near the edge of the tobacco shed, hands in his pockets, head bowed. He had grown taller, his shoulders broader, but it was the stillness that marked the change. He moved like stone, slow, deliberate, unyielding. She found him that evening by the barn, sharpening a curved blade meant for harvesting cane. The rhythm of metal on whetstone was steady, like breath. When she called his name, he did not turn. Only when she stepped close did he lift his eyes to hers. They were not the eyes of a brother, not anymore. They held no warmth, no welcome, only a deep, simmering clarity. Like he had seen something no one should see and chosen not to look away. "I waited," she whispered. "I know," he replied, and that was all. He had been sent to another plantation after the branding, one known for its cruelty, whispered about in hushed tones. Aziza did not ask what he had endured. She saw it in the way he flinched at certain sounds, in how he never entered rooms fully, always kept his back near walls. He never spoke of the past, but at night, she heard him muttering again, different now, calmer, as if reciting instructions to something only he could understand. Within a week, Isaiah became part of the harvesting crew. Though it was not yet full season, the Gibbons had begun cutting cane early, fearing rot. Isaiah worked without complaint, his blade precise, tireless. Other laborers avoided him, not from dislike, but caution. They said he talked to the fields. That once, he laughed during a thunderstorm. Aziza watched, not with fear, but with recognition. Something had settled inside him, same as it had in her. But where she had turned inward, Isaiah had become a vessel for something else. Not vengeance, not yet, but purpose. One night, he left a note folded beneath her bowl. No greeting, no signature, just a drawing of the same seven-fingered hand she had found in the kitchen book, stitched in dried thread. Beneath it, a word in faded ink, soon. The following day, the overseer was found drunk and half-conscious by the stables, said he had seen Isaiah speaking in tongues beside the cane rows, standing perfectly still as the wind twisted the stalks around him. He swore he heard whispering in the soil. The master dismissed it, called it madness, but Aziza knew better. The tension in the house shifted. Locks were checked twice. Guns were cleaned more often. The Gibbons didn't say it aloud, but fear had seeped into their habits. Not panic, just the slow realization that something was out of place. Aziza began leaving symbols from the kitchen book in hidden corners, beneath rugs, behind picture frames, inside pillow seams. Not to curse, not yet, only to mark, to trace paths, to prepare. Isaiah and Aziza did not speak again. Not directly, but the silence between them grew thick with shared knowledge. At dusk, she would see him standing near the trees, fingers grazing the blade's edge, eyes on the horizon, and sometimes he would nod. Once, just enough to mean yes. The third week after his return, a mule was found gutted near the smokehouse. No prints, no blood trail, only a single mark carved into its hide, the crooked letter branded into Aziza's shoulder. The master flew into a rage, whipped 3 men without reason, then locked himself in his study for 2 days. That night, Isaiah placed the blade beneath a beam in the sugar mill. Carefully wrapped in cloth, hidden from all but one, Aziza found it. She did not touch it. She only looked and understood. They were not planning. They were remembering, completing, and the fields, long silent under winter's hand, began to hum. The cane fields ripened early that year. Spring had not yet broken free of frost, but the stalks stood tall and dense, their green blades cutting the air like quiet knives. The harvest began under a gray sky, the kind that pressed against the earth and stilled the birds. There were no songs among the workers, only the rhythmic swish of machetes and the occasional grunt of labor. Isaiah worked at the edge of the field, where the trees met the rows, where shadows clung longer than they should. His blade moved with precision, each swing measured, deliberate. He rarely spoke, never faltered, and though he labored beside others, a strange space lingered around him, as if the land itself had stepped back. Aziza remained in the house, but the change reached her. Meals were left uneaten. The master drank in the mornings now. The children whispered of voices in the night. Once, Eugenia found salt poured in a circle beneath her pillow and blamed the maid, who swore she had done nothing. The girl was whipped, then dismissed, but the next night, the salt returned. Isaiah's eyes grew darker as the days passed, not from sleep, which he seemed to have abandoned, but from something deeper. He watched the cane fall, and something behind his gaze counted, not the stalks, but something else, a toll, a measure. Then, one morning, the first body was found. Reed, the youngest overseer, had not shown for roll call. They discovered him near the irrigation ditch, throat slit, eyes open to the sky. His mouth was filled with ash, his hands folded over his chest. The blade had been clean, surgical. There was no sign of struggle, only the mark carved above his left eyebrow, the same crooked brand from Aziza's shoulder, though no one dared say it aloud. Panic did not break immediately. The death was called an accident, a misstep, a drunken fall, but guards were posted by nightfall, and every worker was searched. Isaiah stood silent as they checked his hands, his boots, his bag. They found nothing. He did not smile. He simply returned to work. The second body came 3 nights later. The head overseer, Cain, was discovered hanging upside down in the tool shed, gutted from pelvis to sternum. His blood had been used to draw symbols across the walls, symbols Aziza recognized from the kitchen book. Not warnings, instructions. The estate shut down. No one entered or left. Rumors spread among the servants of Isaiah walking without a shadow, of birds falling dead from trees where he passed. One girl claimed she saw him speak to a deer, which bowed before him and vanished into the cane. Another said she woke to find him standing at the edge of her bed, lips moving soundlessly. Aziza said nothing, but that night she retrieved the blade from beneath the mill. It was warm to the touch, though the room was cold. She placed it in the fire, as the book instructed, then buried it beneath the roots of the oldest tree near the fields. The soil accepted it without resistance. The next day, nothing happened, nor the next. Then came the red morning. At dawn, the house awoke to silence. No dogs barked, no workers called out. The sky hung low, stained the color of rust. Aziza rose before the bell, her body tense with something unspoken. She stepped into the yard and saw them, 6 overseers, their bodies arranged in a perfect circle, each one missing the same hand. In the center, carved into the ground, the 7-fingered sigil. The Gibbons retreated behind locked doors. Eugenia wept openly, clutching her Bible. Henry carried a pistol with shaking hands. Lila stopped speaking entirely. Isaiah was nowhere to be found. That evening, Aziza entered the fields alone. The cane rustled with more than wind. Something old and patient stirred beneath the roots. She spoke no words, made no gesture, but the air around her shifted, as if the ground recognized her. And far in the distance, where the earth met the trees, she saw him, not walking, waiting. After the red morning, the house grew sick, not visibly, not all at once, but like a body slipping into fever. The air thickened, time stretched, meals were left untouched, fires flickered without wind. Even the mice disappeared from the pantry, as if sensing something they could not name. Aziza moved through this silence as one who had already known it. Her duties did not change, but the weight of them did. She no longer served meals to the family, only left them at the doors. The Gibbons no longer dined together. They stayed behind locked rooms, their voices strained, sharp, sometimes tearful. Once, she heard Henry shouting scripture through a keyhole, though his voice cracked like glass, and in the quiet, the house whispered back. It began with the floorboards, groaning where no foot had fallen. Then came the smell, faint at first, like scorched sugar and iron. It lingered near the stairwells, beneath the portraits, behind the closed doors. Clara, the last of the housemaids, refused to clean the eastern hallway. "There's someone standing there," she whispered. "But when I look, they're not." Then one night, the cellars flooded. It had not rained in weeks, yet water seeped through the stone walls, cold and red-brown. Aziza was sent to investigate. She descended alone, a lantern in hand, the light trembling against damp walls. The lowest room had once been used for storage, now forgotten. Its door groaned open as if exhaling something long held. Inside, beneath the warped shelves, she found the floor split open, not broken, peeled, like bark. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with pitch, were journals, dozens. Old, brittle, their covers scrawled with unfamiliar names and dates that stretched back nearly a century. Each bore the mark she had seen so many times now, the crooked brand, the seven-fingered hand. She opened one, then another. They were not diaries. They were records, testaments from the enslaved who had served, suffered, and vanished within the Gibbons estate. Written in hidden ink, etched into pages by firelight, passed down through generations who had spoken little but seen everything. Some pages were filled with symbols, maps of tunnels long collapsed, lists of ingredients, sigils drawn in layers. Others were stories of children taken in the night, of women buried beneath rose bushes, of a master who died but walked again, his shadow reversed. One entry stopped her breath. "I hid the blade beneath the birch tree," it read. "She will know when to dig." No name, no date, but the ink was familiar. It matched the note Isaiah had left her. This was not old, this was now. Aziza carried the journals back to the quarters, wrapped in linen, hidden beneath ash. She did not show them to anyone. They were not for others, they were for her. In the nights that followed, she returned to the fields, not to work, but to listen. There were voices in the cane, not loud, not clear, but real. Some cried, some prayed, some laughed without joy, and one voice, only one, whispered her name with reverence. Isaiah had not been seen since the red morning. No body was found, no blood, only footprints leading into the woods, and then none at all. The master sent men to track him, but none returned. One stumbled back days later, muttering about trees that moved and paths that turned to walls. Aziza knew better than to search. He was not lost. He was waiting. Again. The journal spoke of the turning, a moment when the pain that fed the land would reverse, when the roots would no longer accept the blood of the broken, but demand the blood of those who spilled it. It spoke of a chosen hand, marked not by birth, but by witness. One line read, "She must see, she must carry, she must end what began with fire." Aziza did not sleep that night. She sat by the fire until the coals glowed white, then rose, walked to the base of the birch, and began to dig. The soil gave way easily, and beneath it, wrapped in cloth so old it fell apart in her hands, was the blade, not Isaiah's. Older, its edge rusted, but sharp, its hilt carved with names, too many to read. She did not lift it, not yet. She only placed her palm upon it and closed her eyes. The earth trembled, not in fear, but in memory. And far beneath the house, something long buried turned toward her. The Gibbons house, though wrapped in stillness, had never truly been quiet. There was always some low murmur beneath the walls, some sigh between the beams. But when the pastor arrived, even the house held its breath. He came without warning, no letter, no escort, no carriage bearing the family crest. Just a tall man in a black coat and dust-covered boots, his collar stiff with starch, his voice low and measured. He introduced himself simply as Reverend Thorne, claiming to be a friend of the late Mrs. Gibbons's cousin, though no one remembered such a relation. The master welcomed him with an urgency that betrayed unease. The doors were opened, rooms prepared, candles lit with shaking hands. For 3 days, Thorne stayed within the house, holding quiet conversations with Mr. Gibbons, inspecting rooms with a gaze that lingered too long, and pausing at thresholds as though listening for something that others could not hear. Aziza saw him first through the kitchen doorway, his shadow long against the floor. He did not look at her, not directly, but when he passed, he muttered a word, not to her, but toward her, and the air grew cold around her shoulders. Later, she found an envelope tucked beneath the basin, addressed to no one. Inside, a page torn from an old hymnal, with the words, "Those who bury do not forget," underlined in faded ink. The servants avoided him. Clara refused to enter the parlor while he sat. The cook burned 3 meals in a row. One of the stable hands, a boy with no fear of whips, left the estate that night and never returned. When asked why, he said only, his eyes were wrong. Thorne walked the grounds at dawn and dusk, always alone. He stopped at the field's edge, where Isaiah once stood, and knelt beside the birch where the blade had slept. Aziza watched him from the shadows. Once, she stepped forward, her hand near her apron where the handle now rested hidden, but he turned to her before she moved. "You've seen it," he said softly. "The hand that waits." She did not answer. "You think it chose you?" Still, she remained silent. He smiled, not kindly. "It doesn't choose, it remembers." That night, the dogs howled until their throats bled. Lila tore every curtain from the windows and wept in the attic until dawn. Henry left the house with his rifle and never returned. His tracks ended at the river. His boots were found on the bank, perfectly placed side by side. The master begged Thorne to stay longer, but the pastor declined. "Your house is not cursed," he said. "It is patient." He left before sunrise, without ceremony. But in the room he occupied, Aziza found a page left on the floor, weighted by a stone from the garden. A drawing, the house itself, detailed with lines too precise for mere memory. Beneath it, the word threshold, written in black ink. And below that, a question. Is it inside or beneath? Aziza burned the page in the hearth, but the question remained. The following days passed like waking dreams. Doors opened that had been sealed. Water dripped upward. The cane in the fields bent at strange angles, spelling no words but forming patterns. The master no longer left his study. His footsteps grew heavier, slower, as if gravity itself pulled harder on his name. Aziza began to prepare, not outwardly, not yet, but in the way she moved, the way she listened. She stopped speaking altogether. She soaked the blade in water drawn from the cellar. She etched the 7-fingered mark into the underside of her cot. She memorized the final pages of the Testament, though they had no order, only fragments. The door was not opened, it was remembered. The ones who scream first do not suffer last. She is not the end, she is the echo. Aziza walked the halls by moonlight, barefoot, unafraid. The portraits on the walls turned their faces slowly. The fire would not catch unless she breathed upon it. The spoons rattled when she sang beneath her breath, and always, beneath her skin, something pulsed. Not blood, not fear, a rhythm, a waiting. The day of the eclipse came without announcement. No one had spoken of it. No almanac had warned. But the sky dimmed just after noon, and by evening, the sun bled into darkness with a hush that swallowed birdsong and breath alike. The household moved slower than usual, as if wading through thickened time. Mr. Gibbons had not left his study in 3 days. Eugenia wandered the halls with a rosary wrapped tight around her fingers, whispering prayers in a language no one recognized. The house, swollen with tension, waited. Aziza set the table. The request had come from Eugenia at dusk, her voice brittle and rushed. "Supper," she'd said. "A proper one. Full setting. Candles lit. Everyone seated." Aziza obeyed. She cooked without recipes, letting her hands remember what her eyes had read. From the book, from the testaments, from the echoes passed through generations that did not write, but knew. The spices were exact. The salt was spoken to. The meat was carved with lines that meant nothing to the eye, but everything to the old root of things. At the stroke of nightfall, the bell rang and the family descended. Henry was gone, lost to the river weeks before. Only Eugenia, Lila, and the master remained. They entered the dining room without speaking. Their clothes were formal, pressed, faces pale, mouths tight. The table gleamed with polished silver and fine porcelain. Aziza stood in the corner, still as the dark behind her. The food was served. Roasted lamb soaked in wine, bread laced with rosemary and ash, sweet potatoes boiled in clove and orange peel. The air thickened with scent. The candles burned low, but none flickered. The eclipse outside held the night at bay, casting everything in a rusted glow. No one ate at first. Eugenia stared at her plate as if it might move. Lila whispered to the spoon in her hand. The master finally raised his fork, trembling. When he placed the first bite in his mouth, the room seemed to exhale. And then they began to eat, slowly at first, chewing with care, then faster, greedier. Something raw and primal returned to them, and the sound of utensils against porcelain filled the air like a chorus. Lila giggled. Eugenia cried. The master dropped his fork, but kept eating with his hands. Blood from the lamb ran down his chin. Aziza watched. No one looked at her. She had become part of the room, more furniture than servant, and yet she felt every gaze, every motion, every bite. She felt the way the food settled into their bodies, how it was not only consumed, but accepted. Halfway through the meal, Lila stood. Her eyes were black, entirely, utterly black, and she began to hum, a single note, low and vibrating. Eugenia clutched the tablecloth with white fingers. The master opened his mouth to speak, but only soil spilled out. The candles went out, not extinguished, gone. Darkness rolled through the room like a wave, and in that blackness, something else entered. Not from the door, not from the windows, from beneath. Aziza did not move. Her heart did not race. The blade beneath her apron pulsed once. There was no scream, only breath, then silence. When the light returned, the plates were empty. The room was still. The master sat slumped, eyes wide, unmoving. Eugenia's head rested on the table, rosary tangled in her fingers. Lila was gone. No trace, only her chair slowly rocking. Aziza cleared the table. She washed each dish by hand, dried each spoon with care. The water did not stain. The air no longer trembled. Later, as she passed the hallway mirror, her reflection paused. It looked back, not with her face, but another, older, patient, familiar. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, the house sighed. The fire began in the west wing. It was not lit by hand, nor sparked by storm. There was no thunder, no candle tipped too far. Only the sudden breath of heat through the floorboards, the kind that wakes a house from its foundation. Clara saw it first, a coil of smoke winding like a serpent from beneath the nursery door. She ran screaming down the hall, but no one followed. By the time the bell was struck, the flames had already bloomed. Aziza did not run. She stood in the kitchen, still, watching the black smoke curl against the ceiling beams. The blade lay on the table before her, clean and silent. She did not touch it. It had already served its purpose. Outside, voices scrambled, orders shouted, names called, footsteps colliding. But the house was no longer listening. The fire moved not with chaos, but with direction. It avoided the quarters. It skipped the cellar. It consumed the master's study with eager hands, then climbed to the bedrooms, where dreams had once curled like fetid vines. It left symbols scorched into doorframes, marks that matched the ones Aziza had traced months before. Nothing was random. Nothing was spared. Eugenia was found collapsed in the garden, dress singed, hands clutching a broken rosary. She did not speak. She simply rocked back and forth, lips moving silently. One of the stable boys tried to lead her away, but she bit his hand and vanished into the trees before morning. The master was never found. Only his boots remained, left beside the hearth as if he'd simply stepped out. In the ashes of his study, they found a journal bound in human skin, its pages filled with copied lines from the kitchen book, though none of the handwriting matched his own. One line, repeated over and over, "She walks, and the house follows." By dawn, the flames were gone. No water had been used, no hands had fought them. The blaze had taken only what it came for. The Gibbons house was now a husk, blackened bones where grandeur once stood. Yet the air around it pulsed with strange stillness, as though the structure had not died, but shifted into another form. Aziza walked the perimeter at sunrise. Her bare feet left no prints. The birds had not returned. The fields were silent. In the smoke-soaked wind, she could smell salt and blood and cloves. When she reached the birch tree, she knelt beside it and placed the blade beneath the roots once more. It slid easily into the earth, as if returning to sleep, as if the land itself had opened to receive it. Behind her, the remaining servants stood watching, not with fear, not with awe, with understanding. No one spoke. Clara stepped forward, hands trembling, and offered Aziza a bundle wrapped in linen, the final journal, the last of the pages untouched by fire. Aziza nodded once. That night, no one slept. The quarters glowed with low candlelight, but no prayers were spoken, only stories, fragments stitched together by old tongues, passed from mouth to ear in careful cadence. Of the house, of the hand, of the woman who watched. Some said she had burned it down. Others said she had merely called it home. The next morning, Aziza was gone. No trail, no belongings, no sound of footsteps in the leaves. Only the sigil carved once more into the lintel above the kitchen door, fresh, deep, and still warm. And across the county, dogs howled at nothing. The river changed course. Children were born with silver eyes, and beneath the ruins of the Gibbons house, the stone foundation whispered, not loudly, not often, but enough to be heard by those who still knew how to listen. Years passed, decades even. The Gibbons house was not rebuilt. The land changed hands more than once, each new owner unaware or unwilling to speak of what had come before. Some tried to cultivate the fields again, but crops withered overnight. Others brought livestock that refused to eat, eyes wide with panic. Eventually, the land was left to the elements, swallowed by vine and silence. It was during a university survey, nearly 50 years later, that the photographs were found. A wooden chest, buried beneath collapsed beams, unearthed by accident when a historian tripped over what he thought was stone. Inside, black and white photographs, brittle with age, edges curled like dried petals. Some were formal portraits, men in stiff coats, women with tight waists and harder expressions. Others were candid, blurred, strange. None were labeled. Not one bore a date. But in each of them, somewhere in the frame, she appeared, not always clearly, not always whole. Sometimes it was only the corner of her dress, the curve of her face half-shadowed. Other times, her figure stood in full, straight-backed, eyes forward, unsmiling. In group portraits, she was never acknowledged, never touched. The others leaned away from her, unconsciously, their bodies tilted by some unseen repulsion. Scholars dismissed her as a trick of exposure, a double imprint, an artifact of old equipment, but the repetition was too precise. Her face never changed. Her dress was always the same, plain fabric, hem worn, a faint shape embroidered along the sleeve, a hand, misshapen, with too many fingers. One photograph in particular drew attention. A family gathered on the steps of a plantation house, children in front, adults behind. A typical arrangement, except for the figure in the upper window. A woman staring down, face partially obscured by lace curtain, her hand pressed to the glass, 5 fingers visible, and 2 shadows beside them. The photograph was tested. The glass pane no longer existed, the house long since leveled, but the imprint remained, pressed into the emulsion like a scar. Local stories revived. Children whispered of a woman who walked the fields barefoot, who spoke to trees in forgotten tongues. Farmers claimed to see her figure standing at the edge of the forest, unmoving, present for a moment and then gone. One hunter swore he followed her into the woods and emerged 3 days later with no memory and a name carved into his chest, his own, but backwards. Old women still traced the mark above doorways. Salt was kept near cradles. Mirrors were turned at night. Some said she was a spirit, bound by fire. Others believed she had never died at all, merely stepped into another shape, another way of being. They called her many names. The one beneath, the watcher, she of the hand. But one name appeared again and again, written in old letters and spoken in elder tones, Aziza. The archives grew thick with speculation. Historians argued over the timeline. Skeptics scoffed, but one photograph, the final one in the collection, remained unexplained. It showed no people, just a field at dusk, the cane grown tall, wind bending it westward. In the lower right corner, barely visible, the impression of a footstep in the soil. No one had stepped there during the exposure. The negative was clean, yet the print bore the mark, and beneath it, scratched faintly in the margin, 4 words written by a hand long dead. She still remembers everything.